reasons. Now, if you look at this laptop, which is the laptop that I use on Planet America, the sticker there has a twofold purpose. One, because being the ABC, we have to cover up the logo that may or may not be underneath there. The other thing is to remind me and others that I don't know what I'm talking about. I have a terrific record of 4 years ago, when I was out in the cornfields of Iowa following what was then 20 presidential candidates in the primaries. It was an open election. It was the most open election since 1928. So you had candidates vying for the nomination on both sides. And I looked at the field of candidates and saw, well, everything suggests this is going to be a year for Democrats in 2008. Looked at the candidates running and I thought, read Obama's book, I thought, well, the country that voted for George W. Bush twice is not going to vote for Barack Obama. He's an interesting guy, but he sees shades of grey that other politicians just ignore. So I thought, well, there's no way he's going to get elected. Not the 50 Shades of Grey. And so that year, I think my bold prediction was, first I thought John Edwards was going to be the inevitable nominee because he was a white Southern male, and the last two Democratic presidents, Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter, were white Southern males, so clearly it was going to be John Edwards. Then I saw John Edwards and I thought, no, it's not going to be John Edwards. I think it's probably going to be Bill Richardson, the Hispanic governor of New Mexico, who was a fantastic retail politician. And in my defence, he was the only candidate, apart from Mike Huckabee on the Republican side, who actually moved his opinion poll position throughout the 6-month period where the two sides were looking for their nominee. So, to my defence, he went all the way to 14%. That was my punditry. Then last year, of course, I looked at the Republicans lining up to take on Barack Obama. And, well, Mitt Romney, he was a retread from 4 years ago. He was a Massachusetts moderate. Romney Care in Massachusetts was going to be hung around his neck. There's no way he'd be the nominee. The Tea Partiers hate him. The fiscal conservatives don't trust him. The social conservatives, the evangelical Christians, he's a Mormon, for goodness sake. They're not going to support him. No, okay, it's not going to be Mitt Romney. Who's it going to be? Well, clearly it's not going to be Michelle Bachmann, Herman Cain. Tim Pawlenty, maybe, but, he's a bit dull. Who's it going to be? Herman Cain? Oh, really? Rick Perry. When Rick Perry threw his hat into the ring in August of last year, he was the inevitable choice because he was in with the Tea Party from very early on as governor of Texas. He was a staunch fiscal conservative. He had a jobs creation record second to none of any governor in the country. It was going to be Rick Perry. The foreign policy hawks loved him. He was gung-ho. He had a helicopter pilot's licence. He'd be terrific. And then, of course, Rick Perry opened his mouth, put his foot in it. Interestingly, though, books just come out in the United States. It was known that Rick Perry had back surgery last June, and he was on heavy-duty painkillers. When he declared that he was running, he had to go off the painkillers because he did one event in New Hampshire and everyone thought he was drunk. So he went off the painkillers, but then, of course, he was in pain. He couldn't sleep, which is why in the second half of all the debates that he was in last August, September and October, he was fine in the first half. By the second half, he was kind of like this because he was in severe pain. And then he wasn't sleeping. He developed sleep apnea as well as insomnia. And this book that's just come out is kind of, well, I'm clinging to it clearly as redemption for the fact that if it hadn't been for this cruel twist of fate, Rick Perry would have been the nominee. But yes, bear in mind Rick Perry with everything else that I discuss. Let's get the big question out of the way. First, the question that I get asked on a daily basis. And it's a question that there is no answer for. There will be in exactly 3 weeks today. Who's going to win? The answer to that is, I don't know who's going to win when they hold just one election. If they hold 3 elections, Obama will win twice, Romney will win once. It's about a 2 out of 3 sort of a likelihood. You look at the polls today. Ironically enough, Barack Obama has 47% support. Mitt Romney has 47.4%. That's the average of national polls. It's very, very close. Mitt Romney in the last 2 and a bit weeks, since that first up debate in Denver, Mitt Romney has made up an average of 4%. Before that first debate in Denver, Colorado, when Obama just didn't show up, didn't want to be there, and Romney put in a quite outstanding performance by most accounts, it was all over. The media was very primed at that point, because we've got another month and a bit of this. We don't want it to be all over now. I don't want to put down the glasses. We've got lots and lots of time on cable news in particular. Phil, we can't have a foregone conclusion. So they were kind of ready for a bit of a change in narrative. And they got it with justification. This wasn't a creation of the media, but the media was very receptive to suddenly saying, Romney's making a comeback, and he did, and he has. The big thing that's happened in the last 2 weeks, which has changed the conventional wisdom based on historical precedent, is that these debates don't matter. That debate did matter. Maybe the only other time a debate mattered was in 1980, when less than a week before the presidential election that saw Ronald Reagan elected in a landslide, President Jimmy Carter was in front in a couple of polls. He'd been putting off a debate all through, Carter had. He'd been saying that he wouldn't be a part of a three-cornered debate. There was an independent, libertarian, former Republican, John Anderson, who was the third-party candidate that year, and he was getting around 10% support. He didn't want a three-cornered contest on the debate stage, because that sort of elevates him again in November. So Carter had been resisting. Finally, they had their debate. And in that debate, Ronald Reagan was able to dispel all of the myths that had really, he'd been, since 1964, he'd been sort of tagged as kind of a slightly more charming Barry Goldwater, but an extremist, somebody that you couldn't trust with the nuclear football. But in that debate, Ronald Reagan, and you see it every time in the pre-debate coverage on the TV, you see the quote, "There you go again," that really, that and the "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago" really summed it up for people. And they saw Ronald Reagan in that one 90-minute performance a week out from the election as not being threatening, as not being Barry Goldwater-like, not being the kind of guy that's going to press the button, but they saw him as somebody who was quite avuncular and charming and folksy, had a nice way about him. And Jimmy Carter was a stick in the mud. And the economy was bad. They were just looking for a reason to get rid of him. Now, the danger for Obama now is the economy is still bad. And you can certainly say that Mitt Romney is no Ronald Reagan. But still, there was a tipping point. Just as there was in 1980, there was a tipping point 2 weeks ago, and now Romney's in the lead. But with all of that in mind, if you look at history, because it's such a small sample size, historical precedents, I love American presidential political history, but you can cut it any way you like. You can say, for instance, well, Americans tend to re-elect their presidents. Incumbency is a huge advantage. One of the main reasons people get elected president is because they look presidential. No better way to look presidential than standing behind a podium with a presidential seal here, having flown in on Air Force One, with the Marine Corps band playing Hail to the Chief. That looks pretty presidential to most people, and it does. So incumbents tend to get re-elected. The only time since the Great Depression that incumbents haven't been re-elected, taking out of the equation assassinations and resignations, was George H.W. Bush in 1992, beaten by Bill Clinton, and the aforementioned Jimmy Carter being beaten by Ronald Reagan in 1980. So you can say, while incumbents tend to win, it takes somebody of the charm and charisma of a Ronald Reagan or a Bill Clinton to beat them. And you could well say, Governor Romney, you're a nice man, you've got an interesting message. You know Ronald Reagan and you know Bill Clinton. He's not a great campaigner at all. I first saw Mitt Romney back in 2007 when he was campaigning for the nomination for the first time. He is an incredibly stiff, wooden personality. Barack Obama has two modes. We saw a different one today than the one we saw 2 weeks ago. He can be what he is, which is a constitutional law professor. And he can be kind of church because the class isn't paying attention, they're not understanding him. And that's what we saw 2 weeks ago. Today we saw the other Barack Obama, which was facilitated by the town hall style debate environment, where he's just talking to regular folks. And he relates to regular folks very well because he spent an awful lot of time around regular folks. He's not regular, he's probably 40 IQ points smarter than any of us have ever met. Mitt Romney, incredibly smart man as well. But Barack Obama's life to this point has been rather different to Mitt Romney's. Mitt Romney, before he had, I guess, the trappings of material success around him, he was in quite an enclosed community in the Mormon community. His history of service, what he did for that community, easily parallels what Barack Obama did for his community in Chicago and elsewhere. Truly altruistic. He is apparently an individual of the very highest moral fibre and character. But he doesn't relate to people very well. He really doesn't. The old expression, I'm not going to say he's wooden, but if he was ever in a Hollywood Western, they'd tie their horses to him. He just exudes that. He's awkward. They call him the Romney bot. It's got something, I think, to do with the elbows. They just don't tend to bend, and he has this strange kind of little mincing walk around the place like this. Whereas Obama's an athlete. He plays 3 games of basketball every week. He is physically very, very comfortable. He just kind of strides around, lopes around. Yeah, he's very, very comfortable with people. He's used to talking to people. Unlike the first debate, which was a podium debate, very formal, which Romney had 21 of in the last year, Obama had 0 of in the last year, hadn't had one like it in 4 years, hadn't had anyone disagree to his face in 4 years. So they came to that first debate rather differently. The second debate today was different. Some of you, I know, have seen it, some of you haven't yet caught up with it. The consensus is that it wasn't a slam dunk win for Obama, but all of the exit polls are saying that he won it by a reasonable margin. About 40% say Obama won, 30% say Romney won, the rest undecided, which in a very polarised environment where people are kind of self-selecting the analysis that they're going to get because they're watching Fox or MSNBC or CNN, etc. That's a pretty significant margin. And there could be a few things that come out of the debate, which we can talk about a bit later perhaps, particularly in the area of foreign affairs, that could also see Obama's perceived victory expand from here. But also with history, history tells us that at 7.8% unemployment at the moment in the United States, we don't know what it's going to be. There are jobs numbers that come out the Friday before the election. So Friday the 2nd of November could actually be the whole ballgame. If the unemployment figure goes from 7.8 to 7.9%, just a tenth of a percent up, which can be just a statistical rounding. In fact, they could create 50,000 jobs for the month, and yet the unemployment rate could go up and Obama could lose. If, however, it stays at 7.8 or goes down to 7.7 or 7.5, that would probably be enough to have people thinking things are getting better. But still, go back to history, no president since the Second World War has won re-election with unemployment above 7.4%. That was Ronald Reagan. But the important thing that year was that things were getting better. Things were clearly getting better. The unemployment rate was ticking down. This year, the unemployment rate has been bouncing up and down. It went from 8.1 to 8.3 to 8.1 to 8.2 to 8.1 to 7.8. So the wind is at Obama's back right now, and if he put in a reasonable performance in that first debate, even guys like me in the media that don't want to spoil the ending would probably be conceding, yep, I think it's over. It just really now depends on what's going to happen in the House and the Senate, but the presidency's in the bag. Well, it's not in the bag as of today. It's still pretty even peggy. But that being said, I come back to that analysis that says that hold this election 3 times, Obama wins twice, Romney wins once. I don't think there's going to be another tipping point like Reagan had just before the election, but we saw again today that Mitt Romney's strong suit is the economy. Obama's strong suit is that he relates to me. He understands the issues that affect me. The big shift in the last 2 weeks, though, is Obama had an almost 20% advantage amongst white female voters. That vanished. And that was incredibly important because the Democrats have been counting on it. John McCain lost the female vote to Obama 4 years ago by 13%. Without that, Obama wouldn't have been elected president. Obama also wouldn't have been elected president if first-time voters had not voted 4 years ago, young people. The youth vote is very important. Romney's not going to win a lot of the youth vote. But if enough of the youth vote is discouraged this year, they stay at home, not compulsory voting. If they stay at home, and we're talking about people that maybe went out and campaigned for Obama 4 years ago because they're in first year of college, and it was like a college crush for them, this wonderful, charismatic president. Well, they now graduated after 4 years. They've got a $100,000 college debt. They haven't got a job. They're living with their parents in the basement. Literally, they're living in their parents' basement. There are tens of thousands of kids that are like that. Now, they're not going to vote for Mitt Romney necessarily. Some of them will, but not a lot of them. But if enough of those guys stay at home, you don't get the same level of enthusiasm that Democrats need amongst younger voters to win in November. So there are lots of reasons why both candidates should win and why they shouldn't win. Before we open it up to some questions, I'm keen to, sort of rather than me kind of going off on my own little pet areas in all of this, to get your questions so we can kind of address those. The other thing I'd say is that as much as, and I'm at least as guilty as anybody at focusing on presidential politics and the horse race and everything else because it's fun. Journalistically, it's great because the stakes are very high. It's the most powerful political office in the world. It's great theatre, and it goes on for a year and a half. And it's as a reporter, it's great. I love it. The taste of the cinnamon rolls that you get in the budget motels in places like New Hampshire. I love it. Can't get enough of it. You get 3 hours sleep and then you're heading off to the local factory to see Mitt Romney shake people's hands. It's terrific fun. It's great. It's so much more entertaining than the campaign politics that we have here, because it's all about passion. The fundamental difference between our political system and theirs is the issue of compulsory voting. Because you don't have to vote in the United States, you have to become either engaged enough, excited enough, or angry enough to vote. Which is why we have a whole lot of issues that in this country are outside the political sphere, social issues principally, that are front and centre in American politics. Friends in America, they don't understand the fact we've got a political system where we don't know or care, it doesn't matter what a candidate for leadership's view is on abortion, for instance. It doesn't tend to be an issue. If something like the vote on AU 486 came up before federal parliament a few years ago, you recall, that was a conscience vote. It didn't matter that the Prime Minister felt this way or the opposition leader felt that way. It wasn't relevant, compulsory voting. Of course, the other big thing with non-compulsory voting is you've got to spend an awful lot of money giving people enough information to feel as though they can vote, to vote on a Tuesday, to get the voter ID that is required, which in some cases now people are trying to enrol to vote. I was speaking to an African American man in his mid-20s, college graduate in South Carolina, who went along to enrol to vote. He was told in order to get his voter registration card, he needed to have not a driver's license, that'd be too easy. Anybody can get a driver's license. Illegal immigrants can get a driver's license, no. He had to get a paid bill from his doctor. An appointment to see a GP in South Carolina is $100. This is a poll tax that he's being asked to pay. Now, I can't prove this, but I don't think if he'd have been a 60-year-old white man, he would have been asked to provide the same level of proof, because it is discretionary by polling officials. Now, hopefully this election, even though it is looking close, is going to be decisive enough that we don't see months of litigation like 2000, because there's the scope for it from both sides. Because Conservatives, I was speaking just last week to Gary Bauer, who ran for the Republican nomination in 2000. He was senior domestic policy advisor to Reagan in the 80s. He, like a lot of Conservatives, are concerned that people who are not entitled to vote are going to be voting. So they're going to be challenging. They will literally have lawyers at polling stations challenging people's right to vote. So if having to vote on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn isn't enough to dissuade you from voting, there might just be a lawyer there. And there are state laws in places like Florida, you mentioned as well, Les, where reasonable cause to stop you voting can be the fact that you have the same name as a convicted felon. Of course, if you've ever been to jail, 20% of African American men have been to jail, 10% of African American men are currently in the penal or judicial system. But you just have to have the same name as one of them, and that is grounds to not let you vote. So voter suppression is sort of the ugly cousin of the inspiring get out the vote, yes we can kind of stuff. The stuff that people get motivated to vote for. So it's a system that has a lot of inherent flaws. And of course the fact that there is a huge amount of money being spent on mostly negative advertising, which means that the United States, which has just been through officially its most partisan and least productive Congress in history, is going to be even more bitterly divided after November than it was before. Because whether Romney wins or Obama wins, it is likely to be, in a close election, and that looks like what it's going to be, it's going to be status quo or near to it in Congress, which means the Republicans have the majority in the lower house, the House of Representatives, where budget bills have to be formed. In the Senate, it's likely that it's going to be a more even split, probably with Democrats having a 1 or 2 vote majority. Ever since 2006, Republicans have used the filibuster, which those of us that like Jimmy Stewart movies remember very fondly. This idea that, because in this country, if you're in the Senate and you're speaking to the Senate in Canberra, you've got 20 minutes and then the bell rings and the microphone goes off and you're finished. Which some would say, and working as I did for the Parliamentary Broadcast Network, particularly when certain senators were speaking, that was a blessing. They got shut off. In the United States, there is no 20-minute cloture. You can talk and you can talk and you can talk. And you can talk and you can talk. In the old days, these filibusters were so rare, they would call for the cots. So you want to filibuster? Right. This would be terrific. But nowadays, because they don't want to have that spectacle on C-SPAN, principally, just the mere threat of a filibuster is enough to prevent, in a parliamentary procedural sense, a bill going to a vote in the Senate. So that just means that unless you have 60 Senate votes out of the 100-seat chamber, unless you have those 60 votes, then you cannot get something passed through the Senate. In Obama's first year, he got that 60th vote because a moderate Republican named Arlen Specter, who just died this Sunday night, he left the party that he'd served in the American Senate for 32 years because he saw the Tea Party Republicans and those who'd signed up to a no new taxes pledge were not going to support stimulus spending at a time of international financial crisis. It's early 2009. So he left the party, he voted with the Democrats, and that first stimulus bill went through. The following year, that same 60th vote also enabled so-called Obamacare, the Affordable Care and Patient Protection Act, to pass. And that's Arlen Specter's legacy. And he was very proud of that. I met him and interviewed him for a program a couple of months ago. But of course, then Teddy Kennedy died, Obama lost that 60th Senate vote, and it's been very difficult to get anything through since then, including things like the Jobs Act. I mean, how could anybody vote against the Jobs Act? Well, they did. Now, this isn't just about Republicans, because with the system they have, bipartisanship is essential. And if you can't get enough people of goodwill to work across the aisle to reach compromise, then gridlock is what happens. The 2010 midterms saw Republicans, the Conservative wing of the Republican Party, backed by the Tea Party, take the majority in the House and gain 5 Senate seats. Tea Party Republicans have dominated the primary process for House and Senate elections this year. So if Mitt Romney is elected president in November, despite the fact that in his heart he appears to be from the moderate wing of the Republican Party, the old Rockefeller Republican, northeastern kind of Republican, who worked very effectively with Democrats to get things done in Massachusetts when he was governor there last decade, he's going to have real problems because the Tea Party, just quietly, doesn't like Mitt Romney at all. They do not want to see any kind of accommodation to tax increases to pay down America's $16 trillion debt. You hear talk about the so-called fiscal cliff. It's a very real thing. It effectively happens at the end of this year. It's a standoff that is potentially even more diabolical than last year's debt ceiling, which had always been just a rubber stamp. It was just, we increased the credit card limit nationally on an annual or biennial basis. But last year, because the Tea Party Republicans said we got elected saying that we would not pass any measure to increase the debt, they wouldn't vote for it. And Washington didn't know what to do because they'd never had people that wouldn't compromise before. And they've yet to figure it out. So unfortunately, whether it's Obama or Romney that wins on November the 6th, they've got all sorts of problems with this fiscal cliff that's looming at the end of this calendar year and doing something about it. Because at the moment, the Republican Party is sort of boxed in because they've all signed up to the Grover Norquist No New Taxes pledge. They can't, and this is what people on both sides will tell you, economists certainly, the only way to address $16 trillion debt is to reduce spending and increase revenue. You can increase revenue to a certain extent by closing tax loopholes, deductions and so on. But at the end of the day, you do have to increase taxes. And they're dancing around this issue a little bit, but it's in broad ideological terms at the moment in the presidential campaign. But it is going to be crucial. And at what point, and whether it is another credit ratings downgrade, which is almost certain immediately after the election, no matter who wins, unless there are clear signs, whether it's through the Bipartisan Debt Reduction Commission, the so-called Simpson-Bowles Commission, or the super committee which formed last year, reforming and trying to come up with a solution to this. But right now, there's only half a solution on the table, which is spending cuts. And of course, Democrats, if they've lost the presidency and their Senate majority as a result of the obstruction of the last 6 years, but particularly the last 2 years, are they going to be in any mood to alienate their base by saying, well, we're going to cut down on entitlements, we're going to cut back on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security? It's unlikely. Who's going to blink? It's going to be a very, very interesting time. So, short way of saying, it's a very interesting period in the United States. And it is a refrain that you hear and have heard, it was certainly around in the 1990s, Washington's broken. A lot of people now think, you know what, I think it is. I think it broke a couple of years ago. Why it broke and how to fix it, nobody is quite sure. Whether the Tea Party movement will continue to exert influence over the Republican Party, whether the Democratic Party, which even though they went into a supermajority in the Senate, but had themselves, just as the Republican Party jettisoned the old moderate Republicans, the Democrats had the same equivalent of ethnic cleansing themselves. The Southern Dixiecrats, the Blue Dog Democrats, they're all a thing of the past. There's 2 or 3 of them left, whereas in the old days there would have been 20 of them in a 60 Senate majority. So the two parties are at polar extremes. Unfortunately, a lot of campaign flags and spin doctors think it's a terrific idea, it's product differentiation. You've got Pepsi and Coke. You've got the party that will raise your taxes and the party that won't. You've got the party that says they care for the little people and that government has a role in that, and the party that says government has no place in the economy. Get them out of the way. Business will do just fine. So there seems to be and of course the media cheers them on, and people increasingly are just watching the station, listening to the radio station that reinforces their view, that amplifies the differences, makes that middle ground where deals are done and legislation is passed impossible to reach. There's a hole, it's a donut, there's a hole in the middle of Capitol Hill, and nobody yet, and I've just come back last week from a trip to the US where I was speaking to a lot of people on these issues, on both sides, all of them very impressive people. None of them know the way through this. None of them know what to do. And it's kind of irrelevant to them who's in the White House, because it's just one of 3 branches, and at least one of them is broken right now, so they don't know what to do. So on that happy note, these are things that are, I guess, occupying my mind a little bit more than most at the moment. Really interested to hear comments, observations that any of you might have about the race currently, questions you might have. I've spent a lot of time in the US during this campaign and the last 3 before, looking at a lot of these issues, so happy to field any questions, try and explain if you've had a lingering question about how does this electoral college thing work, etc. The fact that actually in November they're not voting for the president, for instance, may freak you out, but they're not.